Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through 125 of the most fascinating, strange, and deeply buried lore facts that Skyrim has to offer. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. The stars are holes in oblivion. The night sky above Tamriel is one of the most quietly terrifying things in all of Elder Scrolls lore, and almost no one who looks up at it understands what they're actually seeing. Those thousands of glittering points of light scattered across the darkness are not stars in any conventional sense. They are wounds. When the god Magnus decided to abandon the creation of Mundus, pulling out of the construction of the mortal plane before it was finished, his departure tore open the fabric between Oblivion and Aetherius, the realm of pure magical energy. The tear Magnus left behind became the sun, the largest and most blazing of all these openings. He was not alone in his departure. A host of divine beings known as the Magna-G, spirits who had assisted in the architecture of creation, followed him out. As they tore their own exits through the fabric between Oblivion and Aetherius, each one left a smaller wound in the sky. Those smaller punctures are what mortals perceive as stars. Each one is a portal directly to Aetherius, and each one bleeds magical energy down into Nirn constantly. This is why the stars have astrological significance in the Elder Scrolls universe. It is not superstition. The constellations are genuinely radiating divine influence from the other side of Oblivion into the mortal world, and those born under a particular configuration of those openings are literally bathed in specific currents of that energy from the moment they draw their first breath. Lorkhan's corpse became the two moons. Every Nord who has ever looked up at the two moons of Skyrim, Massa and Secunda, has been staring at a dead god without knowing it. Lorkhan, the divine spirit who convinced the other Aedra to sacrifice pieces of themselves to build Nirn, was punished for his deception when the surviving gods tore out his divine heart and flung it across the world. But the rest of him did not simply vanish. His body, or more precisely his flesh divinity, was split into two halves and cast into the sky, becoming the two moons that orbit Nirn forever. Massa is the larger reddish moon, whose surface appears pitted and decayed because it is decaying, the literal skin of a dead god slowly sloughing away over the ages. Secunda is smaller, pale and grey-blue, deteriorating just as slowly. The dark patches visible on each moon during certain phases are not shadows cast by Nirn. They are places where the dead god's skin has completely rotted away. When you look at a crescent moon in Skyrim, the dark portion is actually transparent, and if you looked closely enough, through the black you would see stars on the other side. That detail alone tells you something profound about how different this universe is from the one outside your window tonight. Magnus fled and left, his tears as stars. There is a gentle tragedy embedded in Skyrim's cosmology that tends to get overlooked because it requires understanding why magic works at all. Before the mortal plane was fully constructed, Magnus was its primary architect. He was the spirit most responsible for planning how the world would be shaped, how matter would behave, how mortal beings would interact with the forces around them. When the project reached the point of no return, when the other Aedra had sacrificed enough of their divine natures that they could no longer leave, Magnus made a different choice. He fled. He punched his way out of the newly forming Mundus and escaped back toward Aetherius, and the wound his departure left became the sun. A host of lesser divine beings known as the Magna-G followed in his wake. As each one tore its own way through the barrier between oblivion and Etherius, it left a smaller wound behind, and those wounds are what mortals see as stars. The reason magic exists in the mortal world at all is that these punctures bleed ethereal energy constantly downward into Nirn. Mages do not create magical energy. They channel it from the endless stream pouring through wounds left by a god who chose to abandon his creation rather than be diminished by it. There is a reason the College of Winterhold stands so close to the harshest weather in all of Skyrim, right at the edge of the Sea of Ghosts, where the sky feels so much closer overhead. The sun is the largest wound in oblivion. Following on from what we just discussed, the sun itself occupies a genuinely strange place in Elder Scrolls theology. For the Altmer, the High Elves, whose ancient Aldmeri culture gave rise to most of Tamriel's religious thought, the sun is not a source of warmth and life. It is a reminder of Magnus's cowardice, the scar left when one of the most powerful spirits in creation chose to abandon his work rather than see it through. In the Nordic religious tradition, the perspective is softer, but still deeply tied to cosmic events beyond mortal comprehension. What makes the sun functionally interesting in lore terms is that it is simultaneously the single greatest point of entry for magical energy in all of Mundus. The sun bleeds ethereal power into the world more intensely than any other opening in the fabric between realms. This is why vampires are burned by sunlight. They are not harmed by light in any physical sense. They are harmed by the direct exposure to concentrated divine energy, the power of the very Aedra whose creation they corrupt simply by existing. Every time a vampire in Skyrim retreats into shadow, they are fleeing from the raw, unfiltered power of a wounded god. Alessia was the first true Dragonborn. Most players who encounter the term Dragonborn in Skyrim assume it began with Tiber Septim, or perhaps the last Dragonborn themselves. The history is much older and much more solemn than that. Saint Alessia was a Nedic slave living under the brutal dominion of the Aelids, the wild elves who had constructed the White Gold Tower and enslaved much of the human population of Cyrodiil. She led the Alessian slave rebellion, a mortal uprising against elven magical tyranny, and when the war was turning and the victory seemed impossible, she prayed. Akatosh answered. The chief of the divines drew blood from his own heart. The lore is quite literal about this, and blessed Alessia with what is called the Covenant. She became the first mortal to receive dragon blood from the god of time directly. Akatosh gave her the Amulet of Kings, sealed the gates of oblivion against Daedric armies, and promised that so long as those of the dragon blood wore the amulet, the barriers between Mundus and oblivion would hold. Every dragonborn emperor who sat the ruby throne after her, every ruler who lit the dragon fires in the Temple of the One, was participating in a covenant that began with a slave woman kneeling before a god and asking for the impossible. The last dragonborn in Skyrim is not the first of their kind. They are the latest in a line that stretches back to one of the most significant moments in all of Tamrielic history. Talos may be three men, merged into one. The question of who Talos actually was during his mortal life is one of the most genuinely unresolved mysteries in all of Elder Scrolls lore, and it connects directly to whether the Thalmor's ban on his worship has any theological legitimacy. What most people know is that Tiber Septim, also known as Talos Stormcrown, was a Nord general who united all of Tamriel under a single empire and was posthumously elevated to divine status as the Ninth Divine. What is far less commonly understood is the theory that the being known as Talos is actually an amalgamation of 3 separate individuals whose essences merge through a process that has no parallel in known history. One version holds that Tiber Septim, Zurin Arctus the Imperial Battle Mage, and a warrior called Wolfhearth all merged together during Tiber's conquest of Tamriel, possibly through the use of the Numidium, the mechanical god built from the heart of Lorcan. If this theory is correct, then Talos the god is not simply a deified man, but something genuinely new in the cosmos, a divine being composed of multiple human souls fused into one transcendent entity. This would explain why the Thalmor's claim that a man cannot become a god is not entirely wrong by traditional theological rules, and also why it is not entirely right. The being worshipped as Talos may never have been simply a man at all. Dragons were created before linear time began. One of the foundational facts about dragons that most players absorb through the game's main quest is that they are ancient, that they predate human civilization, that they once ruled Skyrim. What is less commonly understood is the scale of how old they actually are. Dragons were not created during the Dawn era in any conventional sense. According to Draconic theology, which dragons themselves claim to be the authoritative account, Akatosh created the first dragons before time had a direction, before the arrow of time existed, before there was a before in any coherent sense. There were dragons. They emerged from the same process that brought Akatosh into being, as expressions of his nature, and some of them, particularly Alduin, may in some sense be aspects or children of the time deity, rather than simply his creations. This is why dragons speak of existence in such a fundamentally different way than mortals do. For a creature born before linear time, the concept of when something happened has an entirely different quality. When Parthenax meditates at the summit of the throat of the world, he is not simply an old creature practicing a philosophy. He is a being for whom the words past and future mean something structurally different than they do for the human standing before him. The cold up there is not just weather. Shor is the Nordic name for Lorcan. In the Hall of Valor in Sovngarde, the spirits of heroic Nords feast and fight and wait at the pleasure of a god named Shor, who built this paradise for his chosen people. Shor is described as the chief deity of the Nordic pantheon, a generous and strong divine figure who rewards valor and champions the mortal races. What the Nords generally do not dwell on is that Shor and Lorcan are the same being, and the reverence they hold for him is a mirror image of the contempt the elves hold for Lorcan, for tricking the other Aedra into building Nirn. For the elves, Lorcan is a deceiver and a thief who tricked divine beings into sacrificing their immortality and their power to build a mortal world they never asked for. For the Nords, this same act is heroic. Shor gave the mortals a world, gave them the gift of mortality and struggle and meaning, and was punished for it by the jealous Aedra. The two religions are worshipping the same being and reaching completely opposite conclusions about his character. When a Nord warrior dies in honorable combat and feels themselves drawn towards Sovngarde, they are trusting that the same god the elves curse will grant them an eternity of feasting and fighting in his golden hall. In the lore, neither interpretation is declared wrong. Both are filtered through the limits of mortal perception. The Amulet of Kings was made from a god's blood. The Amulet of Kings is not simply a powerful magical artifact or a symbol of royal legitimacy. According to lore, it is a physical crystallization of Akatosh's own blood, drawn from the heart of the chief divine and given to Saint Alessia as a token of the covenant between gods and mortals. The red diamond at its center is not a gemstone in any conventional sense, but a piece of divine essence preserved in material form, which is why only those with dragon blood can actually wear it. The amulet serves as a kind of lock and key simultaneously. When dragonborn rulers wore the amulet and lit the dragon fires in the Temple of the One, they were completing a ritual action that reinforced the barrier between Mundus and Oblivion, keeping Daedric armies out of the mortal world. When Martin Septim shattered it during the Oblivion Crisis to summon the avatar of Akatosh, he was doing something of incalculable cosmic weight. He destroyed the last physical remnant of the original covenant, the piece of divine blood that had held the gates of Oblivion closed for thousands of years. The fact that Skyrim's era takes place after that moment, in a world without dragonfires or a living line of dragonborn emperors, is a world that is fundamentally more vulnerable to the planes of Oblivion than it has been for almost all of recorded history. The Blades were originally dragon hunters from Akavir. The organization that players know as the Blades, the former protectors of the Dragonborn Emperor, has a history that reaches across an ocean to a continent that no living Tamrielic scholar has mapped in full. The Tsaeshi, the serpent folk of Akavir, invaded Tamriel during the First Era in what was ostensibly a war of conquest. But the Tsaeshi were actually searching for something specific. They were hunting dragons, or more precisely hunting those with dragon blood, because their cultural and religious understanding of draconic power had led them to believe that finding and serving a dragonborn was their greatest possible purpose. When Raymond Cyrodiil, who was dragonborn, defeated and absorbed the Tsaeshi invasion force, the surviving warriors did not return home in shame. They became his dragon guard, the direct predecessors to the Blades. These were some of the most dedicated dragon hunters ever to walk on Nirn, creatures who had crossed an ocean because they believed in the covenant between dragonborn and dragons so deeply they were willing to conquer Tamriel to find it. The katana-shaped blades the organization carries are a legacy of that Akaviri heritage, and the Blades Temple of Skyhaven Temple was built by those same Tsaeshi hands, in the same architectural style that the Akaviri brought with them from across the sea. Artaeum disappeared twice, and no one knows why. The Isle of Artaeum, home of the Sigic Order, holds a peculiar distinction in Elder Scrolls history, in that it has completely ceased to exist within the normal geography of Tamriel not once but twice, for reasons that remain unexplained by anyone outside of the Order itself. The first disappearance occurred around the founding of the Mages Guild, in the Second Era. The entire island, which is described as the third largest in the Somerset archipelago, simply stopped being somewhere that could be found. It reappeared exactly 500 years later, with every member of the Order unchanged and no explanation offered. The second disappearance occurred around 4 E100, coinciding with the mysterious event called the Void Nights, when Nirn's 2 moons vanished from the sky for 2 years. Members of the Sigic Order still occasionally appeared to people during Artaeum's second absence, as they do in Skyrim's College of Winterhold questline. Meaning, the island's absence from Mundus does not mean its inhabitants cannot reach into it. The Sigics seem to possess the ability to make their entire home intangible, to literally remove it from the fabric of the world and hold it somewhere between planes. Whether they do this for safety, for secrecy, or for reasons that simply do not map onto mortal understanding, is something the Order has never chosen to clarify. The Void Nights were 2 years without moons. In the year 4 E98, something unprecedented happened. The 2 moons of Nern, Massa, and Secunda vanished from the sky. Not during an eclipse, not behind clouds, not at a new moon phase where they dimmed to invisibility. Gone. For 2 full years, from 4E98 to 4E100, the night sky of Tamriel was moonless. The Khajiit of elsewhere were devastated in a way that is difficult to overstate for anyone outside of their culture. Among the Khajiit, the phase of the moons at the moment of a kitten's birth determines what form that kitten will take. Because there are over 20 distinct Khajiit subtypes, from fully bipedal to feline quadrupeds, and the lunar configuration is what sets them. Without moons, no new Khajiit could be born into their proper form. The Void Knights created a generational crisis that the Khajiit have never fully recovered from. The moons returned in 4E100, and the Aldmeri Dominion claimed credit, insisting their powerful mages had restored the lunar spheres to the sky. Whether this is true, whether the moons were ever truly gone or merely hidden, and whether the Dominion's claim was genuine or an early political maneuver to place the Khajiit in their debt, is a question that the lore deliberately leaves unanswered. The Thalmor gained enormous influence in elsewhere as a direct result of the Void Knights, and their timing was extraordinarily convenient. The Khajiit lunar lattice protects all of Mundus. Within Khajiit theology, the 2 moons are not simply Lorcan's corpse or attendant spirits of the mortal plane. They are the structural underpinning of Mundus itself. The Khajiit call this the lunar lattice, or Jarkajai in their native tongue, and they believe it is the framework that protects the mortal world from the rest of the Arbis, the vast cosmic space surrounding Mundus that contains both Aetherius and Oblivion. Without the lattice maintained by Massa and Secunda in their proper orbits and phases, reality itself would begin to lose coherence. The Khajiit also believe they have a special role in maintaining the lattice, not through any obvious physical action, but through their very existence as a species shaped by the moons. When a Khajiit is born and takes its form according to the lunar phase, it is in a sense completing a circuit between the mortal world and the moons above it. This is why the disappearance of the moons during the Void Nights was not simply a cultural trauma for the Khajiit, but something they understood as a genuine existential threat to the integrity of the world. There are Khajiit scholars who believe that if the moons were to vanish permanently and the lattice collapsed, the walls between Mundus and Oblivion would dissolve entirely, and what would pour through the gaps is something no mortal army could ever stop. The first vampire was a priestess of Arkay, defiled by Molag Bal. Of all the origin stories embedded in Elder Scrolls lore, the history of vampirism is among the most tragic and the most horrifying, and it begins not with a willing seeker of dark power, but with an innocent woman who had done nothing to deserve what happened to her. Lemay Beolfag was a Nadic priestess, a devout servant of Arkay, the god of life and death, living in the early Merethic era. Molag Bal, the Daedric prince of domination and enslavement, chose her specifically because of her devotion. He attacked and defiled her, shed a drop of his own blood on her brow, and left her to die. A group of nomads found her and tried to care for her wounds, but something was wrong. Her injuries healed unnaturally fast. Frightened, the nomads tried to cremate her while she appeared unconscious. She woke inside the funeral pyre, emerged in a state of violent undeath, and massacred everyone present. When her senses returned and she understood what she had become, she called out to Arkay for help. He did not answer. The bitterness she felt at that abandonment shaped her for eternity. She founded a cult of vampires whose central tenet is hatred for both Molag Bal, who made her, and Arche, who abandoned her. Every vampire bloodline in Tamriel traces its origins back to this one moment, to a Daedric prince's deliberate cruelty and a god's silence in answer to a prayer. Hagravens were once women. When you encounter a hagraven in the wilderness of Skyrim, crouched over a crude altar with feathers and skulls and the smell of dark magic hanging in the air around her, you are looking at a human being who chose this. According to the in-game text Herbane's Bestiary and the Herbalist's Guide to Skyrim, hagravens were once witches, women who practiced magic that eventually led them to seek a transformation that traded their humanity entirely for access to darker and more primal power. The ritual itself is not fully documented, but it involves a deliberate sacrifice of the human form, an exchange of flesh and mortality for something that approaches the raw magic of nature corrupted into something predatory. The Forsworn of the Reach describe hagravens as being ancient, as having been in the Reach since the beginning, and they revere them as matriarchs and spiritual leaders. The Glenmoril witches, who granted the companions their lycanthropy, were hagravens who had maintained a relationship with Hircine stretching back generations. What makes hagravens especially unsettling is the knowledge that the creature attacking you with dark fire was not born this way. Somewhere behind the black eyes and the raking talons and the cruelty is the remnant of a woman who looked at what she could become and said yes. Briarhearts have literally had their hearts removed. The Forsworn Briarhearts are among the most distinctive enemy types in Skyrim. Heavily armoured Forsworn warriors who seem to shrug off damage that would fell any normal fighter. The explanation for their resilience, once you understand it, is one of the more visceral pieces of lore in the game. A Briarheart warrior has undergone a hagraven ritual in which their living heart is physically cut from their chest and replaced with a hawthorn fruit, specifically a briarheart. The human organ is removed while the subject is still alive, and the magical seed is placed in the wound and sealed through hagraven ritual that infuses the warrior with nature magic and removes many of the vulnerabilities that come with being mortal. They continue to function without a human heart because they are no longer quite human. If you sneak up behind a briarheart in the game and pick the hawthorn fruit from their chest, they die instantly because the ritual is the only thing keeping them alive. The original motivation for the Briarheart ritual, according to Forsworn lore, traces back to the Red Eagle, Faulan, a Reachman king who gave up his heart to a hagraven in exchange for the power needed to fight the Alessian Empire's occupation of the Reach. He became the first Briarheart, a spirit of vengeance without a mortal heart, and his legend became a template for the transformation that Forsworn warriors still undergo today. The Forsworn's ancient religion predates recorded history. What the rest of Skyrim calls barbarism, the Forsworn call devotion. The religion of the Reach is not the worship of individual Daedric princes in the traditional sense, though Hircine is accorded particular reverence as the source of Reach magic. It is something older and stranger than that, a set of practices and beliefs that stretches back to before the First Era, to when the Reachmen were first forming as a distinct people in the Harshstone Valley between the mountains of Skyrim and High Rock. The Reachmen's spiritual practices include elements of animal shamanism, blood ritual, communion with hagravens as divine intermediaries, and an understanding of the land itself as a living entity that must be propitiated with sacrifice. Their reverence for the hagravens as ancient matriarchs reflects a belief that some beings predate even the human settlement of the Reach. The Forsworn do not see themselves as rebels or terrorists. a framing imposed on them by Nord and Imperial perspectives. They see themselves as the Reach's true and rightful people, practicing the oldest living religion in Skyrim, honoring powers that were old when the first dragons ruled the sky. The violence is real, so is the devotion. Draga are sustained by the dragon priests. They guard. The Draga that fill Skyrim's ancient Nordic tombs are not simply reanimated corpses in the conventional undead sense. According to lore, particularly the details embedded in the College of Winterhold storyline and various in-game texts, Draga are sustained through a direct magical connection to the dragon priest they spend their undeath protecting. The dragon priests of the ancient dragon cult were powerful magic users who achieved a form of undeath, and the Draga who guard their tombs exist in a symbiotic relationship with that preserved power. During their waking hours, Draga perform actual maintenance of their priest's resting place. The Draga do not simply stand there waiting. They clean the stones, they maintain the ceremonial seals, and they regularly give a portion of their own remaining life force to the dragon priest's continued preservation. The tombs are not simply storage for the dead. They are functioning religious institutions maintained by dead people performing acts of worship for dead gods. When the Dragonborn disrupts a tomb and fights through to the dragon priest inside, they are not simply raiding a dungeon. They are dismantling thousands of years of continuous ritual that has been ongoing since the end of the Dragon War. The Taishi Ate, all the humans of Akavir, the continent of Akavir, east of Tamriel across the Paramaic Ocean, is home to several races that have interacted with Tamrielic history at various points, often violently. The Tashi are perhaps the most well-documented of these, a race of serpent folk who were the original invaders of Tamriel during the First Era. What is casually mentioned in the Imperial Geographic Society's accounts of Akavir and largely glossed over is the fate of the human inhabitants of that continent. According to the document Mysterious Akavir, men once lived on Akavir just as they live on Tamriel. The Saishi ate them, all of them. The serpent folk of Akavir apparently consumed the human population of that continent entirely, and the exact nature of this consumption, whether literal or a metaphor for cultural absorption, is something that the sources are deliberately coy about. What is consistent is that by the time Tamrielic scholars could attempt to document Akavir, there were no humans left on that continent. The Taishi now occupy their former territory, and the question of what exactly happened to the men of Akavir is one that the lore poses and then leaves sitting in the air, uncomfortably, without resolution. The grey cowl of Nocturnal curses its wearer forever. The grey cowl of Nocturnal is one of the most dangerous artifacts in all of Elder Scrolls lore, and its danger has nothing to do with combat. It is a relic that belongs to Nocturnal herself, the Daedric Prince of Darkness and the patron of thieves, and wearing it places you in a unique and unpleasant relationship with the prince. The curse embedded in the cowl erases the wearer's identity from the historical record. The moment it touches your head, any reference to you in history, in documents, in the memory of others, is replaced with the phrase, the grey fox. You become the grey fox. You stop being whoever you were before. Previous wearers of the cowl found that they could not simply take it off and return to their old lives, because their old lives had been retroactively unmade. The history of everyone who had ever worn the cowl was erased and replaced with the single continuous identity of the masked thief. It is not simply a powerful magical item. It is a piece of a Daedric Prince's identity worn as a hood, and Nocturnal does not forgive what was taken without consequence. The curse makes that clear enough. Serana was sealed away. During the interregnum, When players first encounter Serana in the Dawnguard questline, they find her entombed in Dim Hollow Crypt, sealed inside a sarcophagus, in a state of perfect preservation. She has been there for an extraordinarily long time, long enough that she has no knowledge of the current empire, no awareness of recent political events, and a general disorientation about how much time has passed. Based on what she knows and does not know, scholars of Elder Scrolls lore have placed her entombment somewhere during or before the Interregnum, the chaotic period between the fall of the Second Empire and the rise of Tiber Septim. This means she has been sealed in that crypt for somewhere between 300 and 800 years. The reason she was sealed away is Valerica's doing. Serana's mother, anticipating Lord Harkon's increasingly dangerous obsession with the tyranny of the Sun prophecy, and recognizing that her daughter's Elder Scroll was essential to completing it, chose to hide Serana from her own father, rather than allow him to use their child as a component in a ritual to blot out the sun. Every year that Serana spent in that cold crypt was a year her mother chose for her, believing isolation and safety were preferable to the fate Harkon had planned. Valerica sacrificed herself to protect her daughter. There is a moment in the Dawnguard questline when players reach the Soul Cairn and find Valerica, Serana's mother, imprisoned there by her own choice. She walked willingly into the afterlife prison of trapped souls, carrying with her an Elder Scroll of immense power, and sealed herself inside to keep it away from her husband. Valerica is often read as cold or calculating, and her methods are extreme enough that Serana herself has complicated feelings about the choices her mother made on her behalf. But the underlying motive is parental love expressed through complete self-sacrifice. Valerica looked at what Harkon intended to do with Serana and the scroll, and decided that no personal cost was too high to prevent it. She gave up sunlight, contact with the living world, freedom of movement, and any life she might have had outside of Harkon's castle, and she accepted imprisonment in the most desolate plane of oblivion ever documented, specifically so that her daughter and the Elder Scroll could not be used together. The tragedy is that Serana spent those same centuries sealed away in Dim Hollow Crypt in an entirely different form of imprisonment, both of them isolated and alone, both of them paying a cost to protect the other that neither of them was ever asked to pay. The soul gem trade is mass spiritual imprisonment. Soul gems are a standard component of the enchanting system in Skyrim, readily available from mages, alchemists, and adventurers throughout the province. They are used so casually, slotted into weapons and armor and magical items as if they were simply batteries, that most players never pause to consider what filling a soul gem actually does to the being whose soul it captures. According to Elder Scrolls lore, every sentient being whose soul is captured in a soul gem and used for enchantment ends up in the Soul Cairn, the desolate oblivion plane of trapped souls that players visit during the Dawnguard questline. The Soul Cairn is a grey wasteland of crumbling towers and howling wind, where the spirits of the trapped circle endlessly, unable to pass on to their proper afterlives because they were stolen. These are not criminals or enemies of the state. They are ordinary people who died in the wrong moment under the wrong circumstances, and a mage had a soul trap spell ready. The entire enchanting economy of Skyrim is built on a foundation of spiritual kidnapping. Every enchanted sword representing some farmer or guard or traveler condemned to wander that grey ruin forever, denied whatever afterlife they were meant to reach because somebody needed their magical fire sword to work a little better. Manimarco was once a student of the Sigic Order, before he became the King of Worms, before he built the Order of the Black Worm and transformed necromancy from a niche magical discipline into a continent-wide religious movement dedicated to death and undeath. Manimarco was a gifted young student on the island of Artaeum under the tutelage of the Sigic Order. He studied there alongside Vanus Galerian, who would go on to found the Mages Guild. By all accounts, both of them were considered among the most talented young mages the Order had ever trained. The divergence between their paths is one of the starkest moral bifurcations in Elder Scrolls history, where Galerian wanted to make magical knowledge available to everyone, to democratize the study of magic across all of Tamriel. Manimarco became obsessed with using magic to transcend mortality entirely. He began studying necromancy in defiance of the Order's teachings, began conducting forbidden experiments, and was eventually expelled. The rivalry between Galerian and Manimarco became one of the defining conflicts of the Second Era. Two students who began their educations in the same quiet library on the same hidden island ended up representing opposite visions of what magic is for, and the conflict between those visions shaped the magical institutions of Tamriel for thousands of years afterward. Sheogorath is the last hero of Cyrodiil. This is the piece of lore that tends to hit players hardest once they encounter it, partly because of how gentle and joking and cheerfully unstable Sheogorath seems in both Oblivion and Skyrim, and partly because of the specific moment in history it refers to. During the events of the Elder Scrolls IV, Oblivion, the hero of Kvatch, closed the Oblivion crisis by assisting Martin Septim in summoning the avatar of Akatosh. Martin shattered the Amulet of Kings and merged with the God of Time to destroy Mehrunes Dagon's physical manifestation. In doing so, he died. Around the same time, a mysterious door appeared in Nibben Bay and opened into the Shivering Isles, the realm of Sheogorath. What the main game does not tell you is that the Shivering Isles expansion documents the hero of Kvatch entering that realm and, through a process the lore describes as mantling, becoming the new Daedric Prince of Madness. When the Grey March came and Sheogorath transformed back into Jiggalag and departed, the hero took up the mantle and the throne. The cheerful, daffy, unsettling Sheogorath that players encounter in Skyrim's Mind of Madness quest is the same person who closed the Oblivion crisis. Sheogorath in that quest directly references witnessing the entire Oblivion crisis, an event that only the hero could have personally experienced. The mortal champion, who saved all of Tamriel, is now a god of madness, who spends eternity playing with cheese. Somehow that feels right. The Dragonborn blessing cannot be inherited. It is bestowed. There is a common misconception, reinforced by the existence of Dragonborn imperial dynasties, that dragon blood passes through family lines the same way any inherited trait does. The lore is much more nuanced than that. Being Dragonborn is not something you are born into by being the child of a Dragonborn parent. It is a direct gift from Akatosh, bestowed on individuals whom the dragon god of time chooses for reasons that are not transparent to mortal understanding. The reason the Septim dynasty was consistently Dragonborn is that Akatosh chose each generation of the line, not that the gift traveled through blood like eye color. This is confirmed by the fact that the succession was not straightforwardly biological in all cases, and more directly by the existence of Dragonborn individuals who had no connection to any royal line whatsoever. The last Dragonborn of Skyrim is a complete mystery to every scholar who attempts to trace their origins. Nobody selected them. There is no ceremony, no anointing, no institution that decided this person would carry the dragon blood. Akatosh simply chose them, and the day they killed their first dragon and stood in the rush of a soul entering their body, they became something unprecedented, a dragonborn with no dynasty, no empire, no throne, and no one to tell them what they were supposed to do with it. Multiple dragonborn have existed simultaneously. The Book of the Dragonborn, written by Prior Emmeline Madrine of the Order of Talos, raises a question that the imperial establishment has historically been very uncomfortable with, which is whether there can be more than one dragonborn alive at any given time. The official position of the Septim dynasty was that the dragonborn emperor was unique, singular, the one vessel of Akatosh's gift. But the very mechanics of imperial succession make this untenable, because at any moment when a reigning emperor had a living heir, there were potentially two dragonborn alive simultaneously. The Blades maintained their own records about individuals they suspected carried dragon blood, separate from the imperial line, specifically because the institution knew on some level that the gift was not exclusive to throne. What this means for Skyrim's era, where dragons have returned and the last dragonborn has emerged, is that other dragonborn may also exist somewhere in the world without knowing what they are. Mirak, sealed in Apocrypha, is still technically alive and still dragonborn. There could be others. Akatosh does not announce his choices. Tiber Septim used the Thu'um to conquer nations. The legend of Tiber Septim's military campaigns, which unified all 9 provinces of Tamriel under a single imperial rule for the first time in history, tends to focus on his generalship, his political genius, and the role of the Numidium in certain key victories. What is less commonly emphasized in mainstream imperial history is the personal role of the Thu'um in some of his earliest and most important conquests. During the Battle of Sankarator, a young Tiber Septim, not yet the emperor he would become, stood before a combined army of Nords and Bretons that vastly outnumbered his forces. He used the voice. The Nords in the opposing army heard the Thu'um and recognized it immediately, because the voice is a specifically and irreducibly Nordic cultural institution. They heard him shout, and they understood, in that moment, that this man was son of Skyrim, heir to the tradition of the tongues, a dragonborn in the fullest ancient sense. The Nord troops switched sides, not because of tactics or diplomacy, but because they heard someone use the voice with the power of genuine dragon blood, and their ancestral recognition of what that meant was stronger than whatever political allegiance they had been fighting under. Tiber Septim did not simply conquer Skyrim with armies, he conquered it with a shout. The Akaviri invasions were searching for the Dragonborn. 2 major Akaviri invasions of Tamriel are documented in Elder Scrolls history. The first, the Chaishi invasion of 1 E2703, is frequently misread as a simple territorial conquest. The Akaviri Dragon Guard were looking for someone with dragon blood, hunting through the continent for a dragonborn, because their cultural and theological tradition told them that serving a dragonborn was their highest possible calling. When Raymond Cyrodiil demonstrated his dragon blood, the invasion stopped. The army that had been fighting to conquer Tamriel became his personal guard overnight, because finding what they were looking for transformed every motivation they had. This is one of the most dramatic pivots in Tamrielic military history. Not a defeated army retreating, but an invading force kneeling before the man it had come to find. The second major Akaviri invasion in 2E572 was conducted by the Kamal, a separate and different Akaviri nation, and their motivations were not the same. That invasion triggered the alliances that led to the formation of the Ebonheart Pact, and its resolution involved different forces entirely. The Seichi invasion's relationship with the Dragonborn concept is one of the most resonant through lines in Elder Scrolls history, and it transforms that first war from a story of conquest into something far stranger, a pilgrimage army that crossed an ocean to find a god in mortal form. The Amulet of Kings could only be worn by Dragonborn rulers. This seemingly simple mechanical fact has profound political implications that shaped Tamrielic governance for thousands of years. The Amulet of Kings was not merely a symbol of authority or a powerful magical artifact that conveyed blessings on whoever wore it. It was a literal test of dragon blood. Anyone who was not genuinely Dragonborn who tried to don it was simply unable to wear it. The amulet rejected them. This made imperial succession both more stable and more complex than any other monarchical system in Tamriel, because the throne could only go to someone the amulet accepted, meaning Akatosh approved. The political crises during periods when an emperor died without a clear heir, or when the Dragonborn line became unclear, were not simply succession disputes in the ordinary political sense. They were theological crises. The amulet sitting on a dead emperor's chest and waiting for someone worthy to pick it up was a divine referendum on who should rule, and the entire history of the Septim dynasty can be read as a series of people presenting themselves to this relic and either being accepted or refused by a piece of crystallized god blood that expressed its judgment simply by sitting inert. The Dragon War was won because of a single defection. The Dragon War, the ancient conflict between dragons and humans for dominion over Skyrim, was not won primarily through military superiority or numerical advantage. Humans were losing badly for much of it. Dragons are physically more powerful, magically more formidable, and fundamentally more difficult to kill than any mortal soldier. The turning point was ideological, and it came down to one dragon who decided that what the dragon cult was doing was wrong. Paarthurnax, brother of Alduin and one of the most powerful dragons alive, defected. He did not simply stop fighting on Alduin's behalf. He went to the humans and taught them the Thu'um, specifically the shout called Dragonrend, and provided the philosophical framework that made the Dragon War winnable. With Dragonrend, humans could force dragons to land, removing their greatest tactical advantage. Without Paarthurnax's defection, the war would almost certainly have ended with human civilization in Skyrim exterminated. The civilization that eventually built the Empire. The civilization that produced Tiber Septim and the Blades, and the traditions of Nord culture that fill every inch of Skyrim's world, exists because one dragon chose betrayal over loyalty to his own kind. Every mead hall ever built in Skyrim's long history is standing on that choice. Alduin's Wall was built to warn future generations. Skyhaven Temple in the Reach houses one of the most ambitious and haunting works of architectural storytelling ever created in Tamriel. Alduin's Wall is a massive carved relief that stretches across an entire wall of the temple's inner sanctum, and it was created by the Akaviri Dragon Guard specifically to preserve their accumulated knowledge about dragon lore for whoever might need it in the future. The wall tells the story of Alduin and the Dragon War, depicts the ancient heroes who defeated him, and most remarkably contains a visual prophecy of the World Eater's return. The Akaviri who built it understood that Alduin had not been killed, but merely cast forward in time, and they knew he would eventually return. They built this record in a material designed to outlast any book, in a location hidden well enough to survive centuries of political upheaval, specifically so that whoever came next would not have to rediscover everything. They were building a message for people who had not been born yet, encoding centuries of draconic lore into stone, because parchment burns. When Esbern and Delphine bring the Dragonborn to Skyhaven Temple, and they stand before that wall together, they are receiving a message sent by people who died thousands of years ago, who knew this moment was coming. Dragonrend was the most dangerous shout ever created. Every shout in Skyrim embodies a concept through the power of Dovazul, the language that actualizes reality through vocalization. Most shouts describe natural forces, time, fire, wind, elemental power. Dragonrend is categorically different from any other shout in the Minithisi game's history, and the Greybeard's reaction to it in the main questline makes their discomfort completely understandable once you understand what was actually done to create it. Dragonrend was formulated by 3 ancient Nord heroes who used the Thu'um to force the concept of mortality into draconic understanding. Dragons are immortal by nature. They do not have an experiential framework for what it means to have a finite existence, to know that you will end, to feel time as something moving against you, rather than simply through you. The 3 heroes, Gormley, Hakon, and Feldir, took their own mortal terror of death and encoded it into words of power, then used those words to force that concept into a dragon's mind. A dragon struck by Dragonrend experiences, for the first time, the weight of its own potential ending. It is so disorienting, so fundamentally alien to draconic consciousness, that the dragon cannot fly. It lands because it must. It is the most psychologically violent shout ever conceived, and the Greybeards consider it a philosophical atrocity, even as they acknowledge it was necessary. The 3 ancient heroes failed to kill Alduin. They only banished him. There is a persistent assumption among players, reinforced by the game's framing of the main quest, that the last Dragonborn's defeat of Alduin is a second attempt to accomplish something the ancient heroes failed at. The reality is slightly more complicated and more honest than that. Gormley, Hakon, and Feldir did not fail to kill Alduin. They attempted something more specific than killing him, because they had reason to believe that Alduin, as the firstborn of Akatosh and the World Eater destined to consume existence at the end of each age, could not simply be killed like an ordinary dragon. He had a cosmic function. What they did instead was use an Elder Scroll to cast him forward in time, essentially creating a temporal prison for him, and hoping that whatever age received him would be ready. Feldir in particular argued for this approach and carried the Elder Scroll to the throat of the world for the ritual. The Dragonborn uses the same scroll to look back at that moment. The choice the ancient heroes made was not a failure of will or power. It was a deliberate decision to defer the problem rather than risk the consequences of destroying a being who might be necessary to the universe's eventual end cycle. Whether killing Alduin in Sovngarde during the game is truly the final answer, or whether it simply resets things again, is something the lore leaves genuinely open. Gormlith Goldenhilt died because she refused to retreat. Of the 3 ancient Nord heroes who confronted Alduin at the throat of the world, Gormlith Goldenhilt is the one whose end is documented most specifically. She was a warrior of extraordinary power, one of the most formidable tongues of her age, and she possessed the kind of absolute courage that the Norse traditions that inspire Nord culture tend to characterize both as virtue and as flaw. When the battle against Alduin reached its critical point and the decision was made to use the Elder Scroll, Gormley did not participate in the decision to delay rather than fight. She attacked directly. She struck Alduin with the full force of her Thu'um and wounded him, which created the opening needed for the banishment ritual. But she did not live to see it completed. She died on that mountain in the moment of her greatest defiance, in combat against the World Eater himself, and her spirit has rested in Sovngarde ever since. When the Dragonborn reaches Sovngarde during the main quest and speaks to the three ancient heroes, Gormley is still there, still vibrant, still exactly the warrior who refused to step back from the most powerful dragon in existence. In Sovngarde, there is no death to regret. There is only the way you met it. Sovngarde was designed by Shaw and not by any mortal. The Nordic afterlife of Sovngarde is not a place that exists because the Nords wished hard enough for a paradise. It was constructed. Shaw, the chief deity of the Nordic pantheon, who is also called Lorcan in other traditions, built the Hall of Valor specifically for the mortal heroes of men, as a reward for the sacrifice of mortality itself. The logic is theologically coherent within the Elder Scrolls framework. Lorcan Shaw convinced the other Aedra to sacrifice their divine natures to build Mundus, and in doing so condemn mortals to finite lives of struggle and eventual death. Sovngarde can be understood as his recompense for that, a place he built to honor the people whose existence is the direct result of his grand deception. Entrance requires dying bravely in honorable combat, which means the afterlife is genuinely exclusive, reserved for those who embodied the values Shaw finds worthy. This is why Alduin's presence in Sovngarde during the main quest is specifically a desecration. He is preying on the dead in the one place that was built to be their sanctuary, feeding on souls that were promised protection by the god who built it. His consumption of Sovngarde's heroes is not simply murder. It is a violation of a divine covenant. The statues in Sovngarde turn to watch you. One of the most quietly unsettling details in the Sovngarde level is embedded in the environment without any explicit commentary. The massive hooded statues that line the valley, stone giants standing vigil over the path toward the Hall of Valor, turn to face you when you are not looking directly at them. They do not move when you observe them. The moment you turn away, however, they silently pivot to track your progress. The mechanism behind this behavior is never explained. Whether they are automated constructions placed by Shaw to monitor visitors, whether they are inhabited by some form of divine awareness, or whether they are simply responding to the presence of a living person in a realm of the dead is left entirely to interpretation. What is not left to interpretation is that they do it. Players who have tested this in the game can confirm the behavior is consistent and reliable. In a place designed as a paradise for heroic dead, a place where Shaw himself supposedly watches over his chosen people, the act of statues silently turning to observe a living intruder takes on weight. You are somewhere you are not meant to be. The valley knows. The Psijic Order predates the Mages Guild by thousands of years. When the College of Winterhold faculty react with such awe to a Psijic Order monk appearing in their Hall of Elements, the reverence is not simply institutional respect for a more powerful organization. It is something closer to the response an ordinary scholar might have upon meeting someone who attended the first university ever built. The Psijic Order was founded shortly after the first Aldmer settled the Somerset Isles at the dawn of the First Era, making it the oldest continuously operating scholarly institution in the entire history of Tamriel. The Mages Guild, which most Fourth Era scholars think of as the default magical institution of the continent, was founded in 2 E230 by Vanus Galerion, who had himself been trained by the Psijics. The order was already ancient when one of its own students decided to democratize magical knowledge and create a more accessible guild structure. The College of Winterhold, The institution these scholars have devoted their lives to was founded in the Third Era. From the Sijic perspective, it is a recent development. When Quaranir appears in Winterhold and freezes time to speak privately with the Dragonborn, he is a representative of an organization that watched Tamriel's civilization form from the beginning, and he has the particular patience of someone who has been watching longer than anyone else in the room has been alive. The Thieves Guild has dealt with the Daedric Prince since its founding. Players who complete the Thieves Guild questline in Skyrim discover that the decline the guild has experienced under Mercer Frey's leadership is connected to a corruption of their arrangement with Nocturnal, the Daedric Prince of Darkness. What is less clearly stated but embedded in the lore is that this arrangement did not begin with Mercer. The Thieves Guild's founding mythos is tied to a deal with Nocturnal that stretches back to the guild's earliest days. The Skeleton Key, Nocturnal's artifact, is a token of that arrangement, and the position of Nightingale is a formal covenant between certain guild members and the Daedric Prince. Members who take on the Nightingale mantle are literally pledging their souls to Nocturnal's service in the afterlife, agreeing to serve as guardians of her twilight sepulchre for eternity after they die. The entire Nightingale tradition is built on this exchange. Nocturnal's blessing in life and unending service after death. When the Dragonborn takes on the Nightingale mantle and recovers the Skeleton Key, they are not simply completing a questline. They are entering into a binding agreement with a Daedric Prince, Nocturnal's blessing and abilities in life, in exchange for serving as a guardian of the Twilight Sepulchre after death. That service lasts until Nocturnal decides the contract is fulfilled, at which point the spirit passes on into the Evergloam, her realm, where it becomes one with Shadow. This is framed in the lore not as eternal damnation, but as the Nightingale's ultimate fate and honor. Though the distinction between those two things is genuinely worth considering. The College of Winterhold survived the Great Collapse. In 4E 122, something catastrophic happened to the city of Winterhold. The coastline on which the city's outer district sat simply fell into the sea. Within a very short time, the prosperous city that had once rivaled Solitude for the title of Skyrim's most significant northern settlement was reduced to a handful of buildings clinging to a cliff edge, and the wreckage of everything else lay somewhere beneath the Sea of Ghosts. The College of Winterhold, which sits on a promontory connected to the remaining city by a narrow bridge, survived intact. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, but entirely intact, as if whatever event caused the Great Collapse had avoided the college specifically. This detail did not go unnoticed by the residents of what remained of Winterhold. Many of them, grieving for the homes and family members they lost, concluded that the college had caused the disaster, or at least had done nothing to prevent it and had protected only itself. The Jarl of Winterhold holds this view. The hostility toward mages and toward the college throughout the game is a direct product of this tragedy. Whether the college genuinely caused the collapse, whether it was connected to the Red Year's eruption of Red Mountain affecting sea levels, or whether some darker explanation exists, is one of the questline's unresolved threads. The companion's lycanthropy comes from the Glenmoral Witches. The lycanthropy that the inner circle of the companions carry was not given to them by Hircine directly, and it did not exist among the companions originally. According to the in-game lore and the questline surrounding Kodlak, Whitemane's desire for a cure, the werewolf bloodline currently running through the circle, was introduced through a deal the companions struck with the Glenmoral Coven. a group of hag ravens operating in the mountains of Falkreath Hold. At some point in the Companion's history, a previous harbinger or council agreed to accept the Glenmoral Witch's gift of beast blood in exchange for some unspecified consideration. The deal was struck, certain members of the circle were infected, and the tradition was passed forward from there. What makes this arrangement particularly dark is that the Glenmoral Witches are hag ravens with ties to Hircine, meaning the beast blood the Companions carry is ultimately connected to the Daedric Prince of the Hunt, and dying with it in your veins means Hircine claims your soul instead of Sovngarde receiving it. Kodlak Whitemane spent the last years of his life desperately researching a way to undo this, because the most honourable warrior organisation in Skyrim had accidentally sold their members' afterlives to a Daedric prince, one deal at a time. The Dark Brotherhood's tenets were stolen from the Morag Tong, the 5 tenets that govern the Dark Brotherhood, the rules of conduct that members are required to follow in their work as sacred assassins, were not original to the Brotherhood. They were adapted, or depending on your perspective stolen, from the Morag Tong, the legally sanctioned Assassins' Guild of Morrowind. The Morag Tong predates the Dark Brotherhood by centuries. When the Brotherhood split from the Morag Tong in ancient history, driven out of Morrowind for worshipping Sithis, rather than operating within the Tribunal's legal framework, they took more than just their operational methods with them. The structure of their code, the concept of the listener and the writ, the ceremonial elements of their kills, all of these have Morag Tong origins that the Brotherhood typically does not acknowledge. The rivalry between the two organizations in the lore is therefore a family feud in addition to a professional one. The Brotherhood is in some sense a heretical offshoot of the Morag Tong that reinvented itself as a religious organization and declared itself more spiritually pure than its parent institution, while operating on the intellectual framework it borrowed from that same institution when it left. The Dawn Guard was originally founded to contain a vampire Jarl's son. The vampire hunters of Fort Dawnguard have a founding story that most members do not discuss and players do not typically learn unless they dig into background lore. The organization was originally established sometime in the Second Era, specifically to deal with a vampire problem that had nothing to do with the Folkjar clan and everything to do with local politics. The Jarl of Riften at the time had a son who was turned into a vampire, and the political complications of a vampire prince required a dedicated solution that operated outside normal civic channels. The Dawn Guard was created for that specific purpose. After the problem was resolved, the organization continued in various forms over the centuries, sometimes active, sometimes dormant, sometimes practically defunct as vampire activity ebbed and flowed. By the time Isran reconstitutes them in 4E201, the organization has been dormant long enough that most people in Skyrim treat Isran's recruits as eccentric zealots, rather than an institution with a legitimate history. The irony is that when Isran warns that the vampires are making a move of unprecedented scale, his warning carries institutional weight that goes back centuries. But nobody alive is old enough to remember why the institution was worth taking seriously. Gallus was the guildmaster before Mercer Frey, and he knew the truth. Gallus Desidenius, the guildmaster who preceded Mercer Frey's ascension to control of the Thieves' Guild, was not simply a talented thief who met an unfortunate end. He was actively investigating Mercer at the time of his death, and Carlia's journals and the lore embedded in the Thieves' Guild questline make clear that he had discovered, or was very close to discovering, the full extent of what Mercer had done. Gallus had uncovered that Mercer had personally stolen the skeleton key from the Twilight Sepulchre, had been using its power to make himself an impossibly skilled lockpick, while simultaneously draining the Guild of Nocturnal's blessing, and intended to eventually use the accumulated wealth and power for a complete personal betrayal of everything the Guild represented. Gallus had written his findings in a cipher that only Carlia could decode, and it was this knowledge that made him a target. Mercer murdered Gallus and then framed Carlia for the killing, spending the next 25 years benefiting from his theft and consolidating his position while the Guild's luck drained away beneath him. The tragedy of the Thieves' Guild questline is that someone smart enough to see what was happening died before he could stop it, and everyone paid for his murder for a generation. Savos Aren sealed 2 of his fellow students inside Labyrinthian. The Archmage of the College of Winterhold, the respected and seemingly distinguished Savos Aren, carries a secret that the college questline reveals with appropriate horror. When Savos was a student, he entered Labyrinthian with a group of 5 fellow apprentices, seeking the staff of Magnus and Shalidor's writings. What they found was Moroke, the dragon priest bound within the ruins, who proved far more powerful than the group could handle. Students began dying one by one. As the survivors fell, Savos made a decision. Rather than die himself, he used his magic to enthrall his 2 remaining living companions, Atma and Hafna Icefist, anchoring them as a permanent magical barrier to keep Moroki contained, sacrificing their lives and their freedom to serve as an ongoing cage. He then left. He never spoke of it. He went on to become Archmage. Players who enter Labyrinthian during the college questline see ghostly impressions of Savos and his companions replaying their doomed expedition at various points through the ruin. At the end, those 2 enthralled students are still physically present as bound spirit thralls shielding Moroki. The Dragonborn must strike them down to reach the Dragon Priest, which means in order to complete the questline, the player has to end what Savos condemned his friends to. He even left a note in unused dialogue admitting the decision was all his and all his fault. The East Empire Company controls more than trade. The East Empire Company, which operates shipping and trading out of Solitude's dock warehouses in Skyrim, presents itself as a commercial enterprise focused on mining, resource extraction, and trade across the Empire's eastern reaches. The documented lore around the company is genuinely interesting, even without any conspiracy attached to it. The company holds an imperial monopoly on multiple trade goods, including raw ebony, raw glass, Stalrim, and Dwemer artifacts, which effectively means whoever controls the company controls the flow of some of Tamriel's most strategically valuable materials. It was directly commissioned by the Emperor and is controlled by people he appointed, giving it a peculiar status somewhere between a private company and an arm of the imperial state. Its early presence in Solstheim centered on the founding of Raven Rock, specifically to exploit ebony deposits, making it partly responsible for the existence of an entire town. By 4E201, it is struggling with piracy problems in Windhelm's shipping lanes, its operations partially throttled by the Blood Hawkers, suggesting an organization that was once powerful and expansive is now operating under considerable strain. The company's history is a quiet record of imperial commercial ambition at full stretch, and its decline in Skyrim mirrors the broader decline of imperial authority in the province. Dwemer buildings literally grow from the ground. The architecture of the Dwemer is one of the most visually distinctive elements of Skyrim's design. All polished metal and steam-powered machinery and geometric precision, and it raises an obvious question that most players never quite get around to answering. How did they build all of this underground? The answer, embedded in Elder Scrolls lore, involves a discipline called tonal architecture, a Dwemer mastery of sound so advanced it could manipulate physical reality directly. The Dwemer used tonal resonance as a construction technology, applying specific vibrational frequencies to raw materials to shape stone and metal in ways that conventional engineering cannot replicate. Tonal architects occupied a prestigious role in Dwemer society, treated with the kind of reverence that other cultures reserve for clergy. This explains why Dwemer ruins are so seamless and so geometrically precise, with structures that look grown rather than built, because the tonal process shaped materials continuously rather than assembling them piece by piece. It also explains why modern smiths, despite having access to Dwemer metals and materials, cannot fully replicate Dwemer artifacts. The precision required for tonal manipulation is a lost art, and without it, the materials remain inert. The machine cities and resonating chambers of Skyrim's underground ruins are the legacy of a civilization that understood something fundamental about how the world is constructed that nobody living has managed to rediscover. The Ethereum Forge predates all known metallurgy. Deep beneath the Dwemer ruin of Bethaft in the Rift, players who complete the Lost to the Ages questline from the Dawnguard DLC discover the Ethereum Forge, a massive furnace powered by the same volcanic energy that runs beneath Skyrim's hot springs and geysers. What is remarkable about the forge is not simply its size or power, but the material it was designed to work: Ethereum, a crystalline ore that glows with pale blue inner light, and that the Dwemer discovered in specific underground deposits throughout Skyrim. Ethereum is unlike any other material in Tamrielic metallurgy because it carries intrinsic magical properties that cannot be added to it through enchantment and cannot be removed by conventional means. The forge is the only known facility capable of smelting it, and it predates every other metallurgical technique in the historical record. The Dwemer built the forge specifically for Ethereum, and 4 of their largest cities, Arkenthams, Ralbthar, Bethazel, and Mzulft, were established in part to mine and transport the ore to the smelting location. The resulting ethereal artifacts are among the most magically potent creations ever documented in Tamrielic history, and the knowledge of how to make them was lost with the Dwemer when they vanished. Nchuan-Zel was still occupied when Markarth was built around it. The underground Dwemer city of Nchuan-Zel, accessible through Understone Keep in Markarth, was not simply a ruin that the Nords and later the Reachmen built their city above. When the city of Markarth was first established in its current stone-carved form, Nchuan-Zel was still occupied, not by the long-vanished Dwemer, but by the machinery and automatons left behind when the Dwemer disappeared in 1E700. The Reachmen who settled in and around Markarth did so in full knowledge that an active Dwemer ruin hummed and ticked beneath their feet, its machines still operating, its defensive systems still functional. The arrangement lasted, more or less, because the automatons did not pursue organics above a certain threshold of proximity to their designated patrol zones, and the Reachmen learned which zones those were. When the Nords took Markarth and rebuilt Understone Keep into its current form, they were building on top of a functional machine city that had been running continuously since the disappearance of its creators. The Falmer who have moved into the deeper sections of Nchuan-Zel during the game's timeline represent the most recent chapter in the long history of this particular underground space, being occupied by things that were never supposed to be its permanent residents. Skyhaven Temple was hidden in plain sight for centuries. The Akaviri Dragon Guard, who built Skyhaven Temple in the mountains of the Reach, were not simply building a stronghold. They were building a vault for the most important archive of draconic lore ever assembled, and they built it behind a concealment so elegant that the forsworn who have lived in the mountains above it for generations never found it. The Carspire Canyon that leads to the temple is riddled with forsworn camps, which suggests that the approaches to the temple were not secret, only the temple itself. The entrance requires knowledge of a specific combination of pressure plates arranged in a specific pattern, knowledge that belongs to the blades specifically because their predecessors built the place. Esbern has studied enough Akaviri history to know how the locking mechanism works. What makes the concealment particularly impressive is that the temple interior, including Alduin's wall with all its prophetic significance, has been sitting untouched since the First Era. While multiple civilizations built cities, fought wars, and established ruins on the surface above it, the forsworn who sit around their fires in the Carspire camps have been camping above one of the most significant repositories of draconic knowledge in all of Tamriel, without ever opening the door. Labyrinthian was once a functioning city. The sprawling ruin complex of Labyrinthian in Jarlmarch is easy to read as simply a large dungeon filled with draugr and magic and danger. But the actual history of the place is considerably more interesting than that. Labyrinthian, originally called Bromjunar, was a fully functioning city during the height of the dragon cult's power, serving as the administrative and ceremonial capital of the Dragon Priest Council. When the Dragon Priest needed to settle disputes between draconic territories or coordinate policies across the various holds of ancient Skyrim, they met at Bromjunar. The council chamber within the ruins is the equivalent of a seat of government for one of the most powerful civilizations Skyrim ever hosted. After the Dragon War and the subsequent fall of the dragon cult, the city was gradually abandoned, fell to ruin, and was repurposed over the centuries as various groups found uses for its surviving structures. The Archmage Shalidor built his labyrinth within it at some point. The dragon priest Moroki was sealed inside it by Savos Aren, who bound two of his surviving companions as enthralled spirit thralls to maintain the containment ward, and then walked away alone. The ruins players navigate during the college quest line are the collapsed remnants of an ancient capital city. The ghostly apparitions of Savos and his fellow students replay their fatal journey through the halls as you follow their footsteps, and the two students Savos sacrificed are still there at the end, still holding Moroki in place after all the years, bound to their post by a spell cast by a man who went on to become Archmage and never looked back. Shalidor was the most powerful wizard to ever live in Skyrim. Among all the mages who have walked through Skyrim's history, Shalidor occupies a unique position because his achievements are so extravagant that scholars have spent centuries debating whether some of them are actually true. Legend says he built the city of Winterhold with a single whispered spell, U-E-S-P, and the in-game text A Minor Maze both note that many stories about Shalidor are believed to be hyperbole or outright fabrication, and whether the Winterhold account is literal or mythologized is left genuinely open. What is documented with more certainty is that he constructed his labyrinth deep within the ruins of Bromjunar, a magical training ground of such difficulty that many candidates for Archmage did not survive it. He is also credited with creating the Mage Sanctuary of Ayavea, which he later lost to Sheogorath in a wager he apparently regretted for the rest of his life. The scale of what is claimed about Shalidor is exceptional regardless of how much is legend. Most powerful mages in the Elder Scrolls demonstrate their power through artifacts or individual feats. What the stories of Shalidor describe is someone who shaped institutions, cities, and testing grounds that outlasted him by thousands of years. And even if the whispering a city into existence version of events turns out to be embellishment, the ambition embedded in every version of the tale says something true about how he was remembered. The ruins of Sarthal are the oldest human structure in Tamriel. When Ysgramor and the first Atmaran settlers arrived in Skyrim in the late Merethic era, they did not wander the wilderness aimlessly. They established a settlement, Sarthal, the ruins of which players explore during the College of Winterhold questline, is that settlement, the very first permanent human construction on the continent of Tamriel. Everything that followed in human history on this continent, every city, every empire, every institution, every tradition, traces its ultimate foundation back to the settlement whose burned ruins now sit beneath the ice near Winterhold. The Snow Elves attacked Sarthal and slaughtered its inhabitants, and Ysgramor fled back to Atmora to gather the 500 companions for revenge. When he returned, and the Dragon War eventually unfolded, and human civilization spread across Skyrim, it was all a consequence of that one settlement being founded in that one cold place, and the Snow Elves deciding they could not allow it to stand. Players who descend into Sarthal during the college questline are walking through the literal founding site of human civilization in Tamriel, a place so ancient it predates the concept of a written language in the region. And beneath its ruins, they find an Eye of Magnus that the Snow Elves attacked specifically to prevent the humans from finding. The first human city was built unknowingly above a piece of pre-creation magic so powerful that an elven civilization went to war to keep it secret. Spriggans are manifestations of wild magic, not true living creatures. When you fight a Spriggan in the forests of Skyrim, you are not fighting an animal or even a conventional magical creature. According to the lore embedded in the game's alchemical and bestiary texts, Spriggans are not born the way organic creatures are born. They are manifestations, outgrowths of the forest's own magical energy made semi-physical and given a kind of purpose. They emerge from living trees and dead ones, from the accumulation of wild magic in areas of dense ancient forest, and they behave in ways that reflect the forest condition rather than any individual creature's survival instinct. A Spriggan defending its grove against loggers or hunters is not acting from self-preservation. It is acting as an immune response, as if the forest itself had grown an arm to push back an infection. This is why Spriggans behave the way they do around hag-ravens, creatures who have traded their own humanity for a corrupted form of nature magic. For a Spriggan, a hag-raven is something deeply wrong, a perversion of the same wild forces that created the Spriggan. And the hatred between them is not personal, but categorical. It is the difference between healthy forest and rotting wood, expressed in creatures rather than in trees. Mammoths have dedicated funeral grounds. One of the gentler mysteries of Skyrim's wilderness is the existence of Mammoth Graveyard. Far in the eastern reaches of the map, accessible to anyone willing to make the journey, there is a location where mammoth bones are arranged in a way that cannot be explained by natural predation or accidental death. Mammoths make their way here at the end of their lives. The arrangement suggests it is not random, but intentional, that these enormous creatures somehow know where their burial ground is and travel toward it when they feel their time approaching. The giants who shepherd mammoth herds across the plains do not appear to accompany them on this final journey. The graveyard is a place the mammoths apparently go alone. What this implies about mammoth cognition and cultural memory is a question the game poses without answering directly. These are not wolves or bears responding to pure instinct. Something in the mammoth's understanding of the world tells it where to go when dying, and whatever that something is has been guiding mammoths to the same location for long enough that the bones have accumulated into something that looks deliberate. It is one of the quieter and more melancholy corners of Skyrim's wilderness, and most players walk past it without pausing to consider what it means. Dragon lairs are tied to the dragon's personal domain. The placement of dragon lairs throughout Skyrim is not random, and it is not simply a matter of convenient defensible terrain. Dragons in the ancient lore of the dragon cult era were feudal lords who controlled specific territories, and the side sets that became dragon lairs were expressions of that territorial logic. Each dragon that commanded a region established a physical anchor point for its domain, a high place where it could survey its territory, a place that carried enough magical resonance to serve as both a fortress and a declaration. When Alduin began resurrecting his army during the events of Skyrim, he did not distribute dragons randomly across the map. He was restoring the ancient territorial structure of the dragon cult era, with each resurrected dragon taking up residence in its own historic domain. This means that the word walls players find at dragon lairs, the ancient inscriptions of the Thu'um carved into stone, were placed there deliberately by the dragon or its cult followers, not preserved by accident. The entire landscape of dragon lairs in Skyrim is a map of a feudal government that existed thousands of years ago, with each site marking the seat of power for a specific draconic lord, whose bones waited beneath it for Alduin's call. Werewolves go to Hircine's hunting ground, not Sovngarde. For a Nord, the worst possible fate after death is not simple oblivion, but being denied Sovngarde. The Hall of Valor is not an automatic destination for every Nord who dies. It is specifically for those who die honorably in combat, whose souls are clean of corruption, who have not bound themselves to any Daedric power through their life's choices. A werewolf, carrying the beast blood that comes with Hircine's gift, cannot enter Sovngarde. Their soul belongs to Hircine, and when they die, it goes to the hunting grounds, the Daedric prince's personal realm, where the hunt is eternal, and there is no rest and no feasting in a golden hall. This is the specific tragedy driving Kodlak Whitemane's arc in the Companion's questline. He is a man who has lived his entire life by the Nord Code of Honor, who served the Companions faithfully, who has every right to the afterlife his culture promised him, and he cannot have it because of a choice he made as a young man to accept the beast blood without fully understanding the permanent spiritual cost. He spends his last years trying to find a cure, not because he fears death, but because he refuses to let his afterlife be claimed by a Daedric prince he never worshipped and never meant to serve. Falmer have begun to develop language. Again, the Falmer encountered throughout Skyrim's dungeons are often read as devolved beyond recovery, creatures so thoroughly degraded by generations of blindness and enslavement under the Dwemer that whatever Snow Elf civilization once produced is completely lost. The lore is more careful than that, and certain observations embedded in the game world suggest a more complicated picture. Careful attention to farmer behavior shows them using rudimentary tools, organizing into social groups with recognizable hierarchies, and producing artifacts that go beyond simple survival implements. There are scholars within Elder Scrolls lore who note that the Falmer appear to be in the very early stages of cultural reconstruction, rebuilding, without sight and without memory of their former civilization, something new from the material available to them. The Falmer in Blackreach behave differently from surface Falmer, and the betrayed, as they are sometimes called, show variations in behavior that suggest regional cultural differences are beginning to emerge. It is a process that would take thousands of years to produce anything resembling the snow elf civilization that preceded it, and it may never succeed given the environmental pressures the farmer face. But the fact that it appears to be happening at all, that something in this broken species is still reaching toward complexity, is one of the quite remarkable things buried in Skyrim's dungeon design. The bone-strewn crest was a dragon's ancient territory. In the hot springs of Eastmarch, in the geothermically active stretch of landscape, where steam rises from the ground and the water runs warm even in the deepest winter, there is a place called Bone-strewn Crest. It sits above one of the game's dragon encounter sites, but its significance in lore terms goes beyond the standard territorial logic of most dragon lairs. Bone-strewn Crest was one of the ancient domains from the dragon cult era, a high volcanic outcropping that provided its occupant with unobstructed views of the eastern hold, while also sitting above the geothermal energy that runs through Eastmarch's geological heart. The unusual terrain, with its steam vents and mineral pools and the specific way the heat distorts the air above the crest, created a natural fortress unlike any other in Skyrim. The dragon whose bones waited there under Alduin's eventual resurrection had chosen a domain that reflected something about its own nature, a preference for heat, for elevation, for the particular kind of dramatic Eastmarch landscape that makes you feel close to the raw geological process of the world. Most dragon lairs feel like places designed for war. Bone-strewn Crest feels like it was chosen because its occupant found the view worth having. Azura's star is actually a prison. The Daedric artifact known as Azura's star functions in the game as a reusable soul gem, one of the most sought-after items in the game because its capacity to hold souls and then release them for enchanting without being consumed in the process makes it uniquely valuable to enchanters. The lore behind the artifact is considerably darker than its utility suggests. The star is not simply a magical container. According to the lore surrounding the Azura's Star questline and the various texts discussing the artifact's history, the interior of the star has a particular quality that makes the soul-trapping experience different from a conventional soul gem. There is a mage named Nelakar in Winterhold who has studied the artifact intensively, and his account suggests that souls trapped inside the star are fully conscious, aware, and perpetually imprisoned in what amounts to a private afterlife within the gem. When the corrupted Black Star version is created by trapping a human soul inside, that person is condemned to conscious imprisonment in the artifact indefinitely, without death, without release, without any of the release that even the Soul Cairn's bleak existence offers. The line between a useful magical tool and a torture device depends entirely on whether you consider the awareness of what is inside it. Nordic tombs were designed to function as traps. From the beginning, the elaborate puzzle and trap mechanics that players navigate through Nordic ruins are not simply dungeon design imposed by game developers to create engaging gameplay. According to the logic of the lore, they are exactly what they appear to be: genuine defense systems built into the tombs by the people who constructed them. Nordic tomb architecture from the Dragon Cult era and the early kingdoms of Skyrim was designed with a specific intention of keeping out those who did not belong there. The claw-shaped keys that open the ring puzzles scattered throughout these ruins are the literal keys to those rooms, held by the families or organizations responsible for maintaining the tombs, distributed to those with legitimate access and withheld from everyone else. The revolving symbol puzzles that lock many of the deeper chambers require knowledge that must be given to you, either by the tomb's custodians or through study of the relevant claw. This means that every Nordic ruin the Dragonborn breaks into by solving these puzzles represents the cracking of a security system that was designed to be deliberately exclusive. The Nordic dead were not simply buried. They were locked away, protected by architecture that assumed someone would eventually come looking, and intended to require proof of legitimacy before granting access. The Thuum has a written form that dragons can carve into stone. Word walls, the Tuidin, carved stone monoliths scattered across Skyrim's landscape that contain new words of power for the player to absorb, are not simply decorative in-world monuments with convenient gameplay function. In terms of lore, they represent the written form of the dragon language, Dovazul, encoded into physical stone by either dragons themselves or by dragon priests working on their behalf. The act of writing Dovazul is itself a magical act, because the dragon language actualizes concepts through vocalization. Its written form carries a residual charge of that same power. This is why players can absorb a word of power from a word wall simply by reading it. The understanding transfers not through study in the conventional sense, but through a kind of magical resonance, the same process that allows a dragonborn to fully comprehend a shout by absorbing a dragon's soul. The word walls were not carved as decoration or record keeping. They were carved as instruction, as a way to preserve and transmit the power of specific shouts to those with the capacity to receive them, ensuring that the knowledge encoded in those sounds would survive even if every living speaker of Dovazul was destroyed. They are one of the most durable libraries ever created. Alduin's Wall contains a section that has never been fully translated. The mural carved in Skyhaven Temple is the most comprehensive single record of draconic lore ever produced in Tamrielic history, and it was created by Akaviri scholars who devoted their careers to understanding dragons well enough to carve that understanding into stone for future generations. But despite Esbern's deep scholarly knowledge and the Blade's centuries of institutional memory, there is a section of Alduin's Wall that has never been successfully translated, a portion of the carved imagery that uses Akaviri pictographic elements in a way that does not map clearly onto any known interpretive framework. This suggests either that the Akaviri scholars who created the wall encoded information in a cipher or visual language specific to their institution, information that they did not want broadly accessible even to future generations who would find the wall, or that the section references events or concepts so far removed from mortal experience that the pictographic vocabulary available to the carvers was insufficient to fully express what they were trying to record. What is in that untranslated section is deliberately left open by the lore. It may simply be decorative. It may contain the most important information on the entire wall. The people who could answer that question have been dead for thousands of years. The Dwemer automatons are still fulfilling their last orders. The dwarven spheres, spiders and centurions that patrol the ruins of Skyrim's Dwemer cities are not malfunctioning. They are working exactly as designed. The automatons were created to maintain and protect the Dwemer's underground infrastructure, and that is precisely what they have continued to do for thousands of years since their creators vanished. No one gave them new orders. They received the original orders and are still executing them. What this means, in practical terms, is that the automata are defending empty buildings, maintaining ventilation systems that circulate air for residents who no longer exist, and patrolling corridors whose purpose has outlasted any context for understanding it. The Dwarven Centurions specifically were created as heavy military units for serious defense, and they continue to function as such, treating anyone who enters the ruins as an intruder, even though there is nothing inside to protect. The profound sadness of this, a civilization's last act of sustained presence in the world, being a set of mechanical soldiers walking their rounds in abandoned halls, is something the game presents without comment. You fight the automatons because they attack you. Their reason for attacking is that you are in a place they were told no one should be. They are entirely correct about their orders. They are simply wrong about the conditions that made those orders sensible. Mehrunes' razor has killed gods. The artifact central to the Pieces of the Past questline in Skyrim is treated in the game as a powerful dagger that has a chance to kill any enemy instantly. The lore around Mehrunes' razor is considerably more significant than that mechanical description suggests. Mehrunes' razor, also called Mehrunes Dagon's razor or the Dagger of the Final Wounds, is an artifact connected to one of the most powerful and destructive Daedric princes in the Pantheon. The razor has been described in various Elder Scrolls lore sources as an artifact capable of killing entities that would normally be immune to mortal weapons, including divine beings, because its enchantment operates at a level that bypasses the metaphysical protections that protect gods. Whether it has actually killed a god or gods in the established lore is debated among scholars within the game world. What is clear is that the Mythic Dawn cult, whose members assassinated the Emperor Uriel Septim at the beginning of Oblivion, believed the razor was the instrument necessary for their plans, and that its power to end things that should not be able to end is the basis of Mehrunes Dagon's interest in it. The Smith Sealer's Vesius reassembles it from fragments during the Skyrim questline, reforging an artifact that was deliberately broken and scattered. The very fact that someone thought destroying it was necessary is part of what the razor's history tells you. The Dwemer used the Falmer as experimental subjects. The transformation of the Snow Elves into the former was not simply the natural consequence of generations lived underground in darkness and forced labor. The Dwemer actively experimented on the Snow Elves who had come to them for refuge. The evidence within the lore suggests that the Snow Elves were deliberately fed the toxic underground fungi that destroyed their site, not simply because it was the easiest food source to provide them, but because the Dwemer were interested in what the consumption would do. The Dwemer were a civilization defined by systematic inquiry. Their approach to the Snow Elves was characteristic of their approach to everything else. Here is a variable we can manipulate. Here is a population we can observe. Here is a question about biological change under controlled conditions. The fact that the controlled condition was generations of enslavement and forced deprivation was not, from the Dwemer's perspective, a moral barrier to the experiment. This is one of the darkest corners of Skyrim's lore, not because it involves dramatic violence, but because of what it reveals about the Dwemer's relationship to other living beings. Their intellectual sophistication existed entirely separately from anything resembling ethical consideration. They were brilliant and indifferent in the same moment, which makes them more genuinely chilling than a simply cruel civilization would be. Aedra cannot truly act in the mortal world. One of the structural facts of Elder Scrolls cosmology that shapes almost everything in the lore is the difference between Aedra and Daedra. In terms of their ability to act in Nirn, the Daedra, who did not sacrifice parts of themselves to build the mortal world, retain their full divine power and can manifest in Oblivion and send aspects of themselves into the mortal plane without any fundamental cost. The Aedra, the gods who built Nirn by sacrificing pieces of their divine nature, diminish themselves so profoundly in the act of creation that they cannot act directly in the mortal world they made. This is why Aedric artifacts, like the Amulet of Kings or Oriel's Bow, were created and left as proxies. The gods cannot come themselves. They can leave tools. The divines, the 8 gods worshipped across the empire, occasionally make their influence felt through dreams or visions, or through the actions of their priests. But direct intervention of the kind the Daedric princes routinely demonstrate is not available to them. The world they built cost them the ability to directly shape it. This structural asymmetry explains a great deal about the religious politics of Tamriel and about why the Daedra, despite being consistently framed as dangerous and morally suspect, feel so much more present than the Aedra in the game worlds the series inhabits. The Greybeards have remained silent for centuries. The order of monks at High Hrothgar, who have devoted themselves to the meditation on the way of the voice, and who serve as Parthenax's connection to the mortal world, have not spoken in decades by the time the Dragonborn arrives. Their leader Arngir, who does the speaking on behalf of the group, explains that they practice extreme restraint in their use of the Thu'um, because their shouts at full power are capable of causing devastating damage simply through the act of speech. The Greybeards are so deeply trained in the voice that normal conversation represents a risk to whoever is in the room with them. The story of Jurgen Windcaller, who founded the Greybeards' order centuries earlier, begins with a battle in which so many Nord Thu'um users shouted at full power that their combined force caused a catastrophe, at which point Jurgen Windcaller underwent a transformation and concluded that the power of the voice should be devoted to contemplation rather than violence. The monastery he established at High Hrothgar has maintained that tradition ever since. When the Greybeards summon the Dragonborn by calling out the name Dovahkiin across all of Skyrim, the sound of that call is heard and felt everywhere in the province simultaneously. That is the quiet version of what they can do. Kine is the Nordic form of Kinnereth. The divine being the Nords call Kine, and the being the Empire calls Kinnereth are in the rationalized theology of the Third Era, the same entity understood through different cultural lenses. Kine is the widow of Shor, the Nordic name for Lorcan, and is described in the oldest Nordic accounts as the most human-hearted of the sky spirits, the one who grieved genuinely for what was lost when Shor was destroyed by the other gods. She is sometimes credited with teaching the Thu'um to mortals, acting as the intermediary who gave humanity the weapon they would use to free themselves from dragon dominion. In the Nordic tradition, Kine is a god of storms, of the wilderness, and of the wind that carries the Thu'um. Her association with weather is not simply about the atmosphere. In Nordic cosmology, the breath of the world is a literal force that the sky deity controls, and the Thu'um is the mortal echo of that divine respiration. When the Dragonborn shouts, they are accessing something that was originally Kine's domain and that she gave to mortals as a gift. The Greybeards' reverence for the voice is, in this theological framework, also reverence for Kine, and the way of the voice that Parthenax teaches on the throat of the world is rooted in what the sky deity originally intended for the power she shared. The Thieves' Guild has its own theology. The organization based in the Ratway beneath Riften maintains a relationship with the Daedric Prince Nocturnal that goes beyond simple divine patronage. The Nightingale Trinity, the 3 agents Nocturnal chooses from the guild's ranks in each generation, are bound to her in a specific covenant that continues after their deaths. When a Nightingale dies, their soul does not go to the afterlife they would otherwise be destined for. They go to the Evergloam, Nocturnal's realm of perpetual darkness, where they serve as the guardians of the Ebonmere for eternity. This is presented in the questline as an honor, and from Nocturnal's perspective it may well be. From the perspective of the Nightingale, it is a permanent reassignment of their afterlife to a prince's service in exchange for the abilities they received during their career. The Thieves Guild does not advertise this arrangement to its general membership. It is information that the Nightingale agents discover as part of their induction. What makes this theologically interesting is that Nocturnal's covenant is not unusual among Daedric prince relationships with mortal servants. Many Daedric patrons claim the souls of their most devoted followers. What distinguishes the Nightingale arrangement is that it is framed as a guild's institutional relationship, a contract that the organization has maintained across multiple generations with a consistent divine counterparty, something closer to a business relationship than a religious one. Hermaeus Mora knows things that cannot be known. The Daedric prince whose sphere is knowledge, fate, and memory occupies a unique position among the Daedric princes because his power is not primarily destruction, domination, or any form of physical force. Hermaeus Mora simply knows things. His realm, Apocrypha, is an infinite library containing the accumulated record of every secret that has ever existed, is existing, or will ever exist. He does not need agents to gather information for him. He already has it. What he uses his agents for is the acquisition of knowledge that is categorized differently from ordinary secrets, specifically the kinds of knowledge that are not simply secret, but are forbidden, the insights that the other Daedric princes and the Aedra would prefer remain inaccessible. His interest in the Dragonborn is not incidental. The Dragonborn's ability to absorb dragon souls gives them access to knowledge encoded in those souls that cannot be obtained any other way. Mora wants that knowledge and is willing to provide significant power in exchange for it. The lore positions Mora as genuinely ancient, even by Daedric standards, as an entity whose awareness encompasses more of the Orbi than most of the other princes. His eye, the single massive pupil that serves as his physical manifestation in Apocrypha, is not simply imagery. It communicates something real about what Mora is, the act of perception extended to its absolute limit, an entity that has been watching everything for longer than most other forms of existence have been watching anything. Athinskaten. The 500 companions were not actually 500. The legendary army Ysgramor assembled after the Night of Tears to reclaim Skyrim from the Snow Elves is called the 500 Companions in Nordic tradition, and that number has become the sacred accounting of the Return's heroic force. The in-universe lore is pleasantly honest about this. The full name, as used in some accounts, is the 500 Mighty Companions, or thereabouts, of Ysgramor the Returned. The qualifier or thereabouts is not a translation artifact. Nordic tradition preserved the count as 500 because it was a meaningful round number that captured the scale of the force, but the actual number of warriors who crossed the Sea of Ghosts with Ysgramor was not precisely 500 and may have been somewhat different. This small detail reveals something about how the Elder Scrolls lore handles the relationship between history and legend. Historical events in Tamriel are not recorded with modern precision. They are transmitted through a chain of oral tradition, written accounts, and institutional memory that all introduce their own variations. The 500 Companions is the story that became canonical, because it was the story that served the purposes of the people telling it. The thereabouts acknowledgement buried in the full name is the lore being quietly self-aware about the nature of all heroic history. The throat of the world may be the first land. the name the Nords give to the highest peak in Skyrim, and the name Paarthurnax gives it in the dragon language, points toward an understanding of the mountain that goes beyond geography. In the Nordic creation mythology, which relates the process of creation as a collaboration of divine forces that preceded linear time, there is an account of the moment when the first land emerged from the chaos of the Dawn era. The throat of the world, in some accounts, was that first emergence. It was the first solid thing, the first point at which the process of creating a habitable world achieved a stable form that would persist. The word wall at the summit of the mountain encodes the dragon language in stone that was placed there in the ancient era, and the summit itself has been inhabited by Paarthurnax since before most of the events that make up Skyrim's recorded history. For the Nords, the pilgrimage to High Hrothgar is not simply a test of physical endurance. It is a literal ascent toward the place where the world began, a movement toward the origin point of solid creation. When the Dragonborn climbs those 7,000 steps and stands at the throat of the world to learn Dragonrend, they are standing at what may be the oldest place in the mortal world, at the top of the first thing that ever was. The Dwemer were elves who rejected their own nature. The Dwemer's cultural divergence from the other Aldmeri peoples who became the various elven races of Tamriel is one of the most interesting trajectories in the lore. All Mer share an origin in the ancient Aldmer, the ancestral elves from whom every current elven race descended through a process of cultural and environmental adaptation over thousands of years. The Dwemer's divergence from the Aldmeri tradition was not simply geographic, it was philosophical. They rejected the polytheistic structure that all other Aldmeri cultures maintained, rejected the worship of Aedra and Daedra alike, and built instead a civilization premised on the idea that the universe was comprehensible through systematic inquiry, and that what other races called gods were simply powerful forces that could be analyzed and potentially replicated. This made them unique among all the peoples of Tamriel. Atheists in a world where gods demonstrably exist and occasionally walk among mortals. The Dwemer did not deny that Magnus, Lorcan, and the other divine beings had participated in creation. They denied that this participation made those beings worthy of worship. What they built from that premise, a civilization of extraordinary technological sophistication and profound ethical blindness, is the Dwemer's enduring legacy. The ruins, the automatons, the mystery of their disappearance, and the question of whether they were right. The Wolf Queen of Solitude has never truly left. Patima Septim, known as the Wolf Queen, ruled Solitude in the Third Era and conducted a war using necromancy to raise undead armies that destabilized the Empire for years. She died in her throne room in the High Blue Palace, but her spirit refused to complete the transition to whatever afterlife awaited her. The quest, The Wolf Queen Awakened, which follows from the initial Patema questline, involves a cult attempting to fully resurrect her within the catacombs beneath Solitude. They very nearly succeed. What makes Patema interesting as a character in the lore is the nature of her will. She does not simply appear as an undead monster in the way that most necromancy-created undead do. She retains her personality, her intelligence, her bitterness, and her ambition in a way that suggests she was not simply raised, but persisted. The distinction matters because it says something about the degree of a person's connection to the mortal world at the moment of death. Patema had invested so much of herself in the plan, she died before completing that the investment itself kept her anchored. The lore positions very strong emotional or purposeful attachment as capable of generating exactly this kind of liminal persistence, souls that are not ready to move on, and whose refusal to do so creates what other people experience as haunting. 1,000 years of dragons would follow the Dragonborn. The implications of the final moments of Skyrim's main questline are something the game itself does not elaborate on in detail, but the lore supports a reading of what the Dragonborn situation is after Alduin falls. Dragons are not destroyed when the Dragonborn absorbs their souls. They are consumed, integrated, their power added to the Dragonborn's own. Every dragon soul the player absorbs throughout the game represents a being that once existed and whose essence now lives within the Dragonborn. By the end of the questline, the Dragonborn carries within them the accumulated power of every dragon they have killed, plus the soul they received from Akatosh. Paarthurnax, speaking after Alduin's defeat, notes that some of the surviving dragons may attempt to challenge their Dragonborn for dominance, because the death of Alduin creates a power vacuum that dragon instinct will push every surviving dragon to try to fill. The Dragonborn, if they continue to absorb souls, will over time accumulate the essence of an entire generation of dragons. What this does to the being carrying that accumulation is not something the game's narrative has time to fully explore. Mirag had absorbed souls for millennia in Apocrypha. What the Dragonborn becomes after another 1,000 years, carrying what they already carry forward through time, is the question Skyrim's story plants without answering. Argonian life cycles are tied to the Hist in ways not fully understood. The biological relationship between Argonians and the Hist is one of the most unusual in Tamriel, and one that even scholars who have studied Blackmarsh intensively cannot fully account for. Argonians, who are separated from the Hist for extended periods, show measurable changes in their biology. In regions without Heisty, trees, Argonian reproduction is possible, but operates differently from the Hist-mediated process in Blackmarsh. Female Argonians in environments without Hist can, according to some accounts, take on a Hist-like role for their community, allowing reproduction to continue in the absence of the tree's influence. This suggests that the connection between Argonians and Hist is not simply cultural or spiritual, but is embedded in Argonian biology at a level that adapts in response to environmental absence. Argonians in Skyrim, far from any Hist tree, are participating in a community whose biological needs are being managed without the mechanism they were designed to operate through. The ones the Dragonborn encounters in Riften and in Windhelm carry that gap with them, separated from an essential part of their species' function by hundreds of miles and an inhospitable climate. What Argonian culture and biology does, with that absence how it adapts, is one of the quiet background conditions of every Argonian the player meets in the province. The divines are not uniformly benevolent. The 9 divines, the official pantheon of the Tamrielic Empire, are presented in most imperial religious texts as a collection of entirely good and well-intentioned divine beings who created the mortal world and wish it well. The lore, particularly when read across multiple sources and perspectives, is more complicated. Arche, the god of the cycle of life and death, opposed the development of any form of immortality specifically because mortality is part of his sphere, which means that divine opposition to vampirism and necromancy is also partly a turf defense. Mara, the goddess of love, has a history in pre-imperialized cultures that made her a god of lust and passion, rather than the more domesticated figure of marriage and family she becomes in the imperial tradition. Stendar, the god of mercy and justice, is also the patron deity of the Vigil of Stendar. the organization that hunts Daedra worshippers and lycanthropes with methods that make mercy a complicated attribution. The Aedra are genuinely more invested in mortal welfare than the Daedric princes in structural terms, because the mortal world is made of them. But that investment is not the same as unconditional benevolence. The divines have interests, spheres, and theological positions, and what they want for mortals is shaped by those interests in ways that are not always aligned with what any given mortal would want for themselves. The Dragonborn's voice changes the physics of the world. A last thought to carry into your rest tonight. When you shout in Skyrim, the game gives you a visual effect and a mechanical outcome. What the lore says is happening is something considerably more profound. The dragon language does not describe reality. It is reality, stated aloud by a being with the capacity to make the statement valid. When the Dragonborn shouts Fusro Da, they are not casting a spell or projecting a physical force through air pressure. They are saying, with the authority granted by dragon blood and dragon soul, that the force goes here, now, in this direction, at this magnitude. The universe, which was built by divine beings using a form of divine speech during the process of creation, recognizes the claim and complies. This is why the Greybeard's emphasis on meditation and restraint is not simply monastic prudence. If the Dragonborn shouts without genuine understanding of what they are saying, they are making statements about reality that they do not fully intend, with consequences they cannot fully anticipate. The training Paarthurnax offers is not about increasing power. It is about increasing the precision of meaning, learning to say exactly what you mean, nothing more, so that when you speak and the world listens, the world does what you wanted rather than what you said. That distinction between what you intended and what you said is the entire difference between wisdom and catastrophe. The afflicted of Peryite were sent to spread a plague. Peryite is frequently underestimated as a Daedric prince because his sphere, tasks, and natural order sounds less dramatic than the domains of Molag Bal or Mehrunes Dagon. His followers in Skyrim, the afflicted encountered near Bethadams, demonstrate that a Daedric prince's influence does not need to be spectacular to be consequential. Peryite infected the afflicted with a magical disease and commanded them to spread to populated areas and transmit it. His plan, as the quest, The Only Cure makes clear, is to produce a plague outbreak among Skyrim's population, fulfilling his divine interest in disease as a mechanism of natural order. His followers believe this is a gift. The disease they carry is not simply debilitating. It is specifically designed to spread efficiently through contact, and the afflicted themselves are aware of what they have been asked to do and are willing. What makes Peryite's approach distinctive among the Daedric princes encountered in Skyrim is that his agents are believers rather than slaves. They have accepted the disease willingly as a mark of Peryite's favor and are enthusiastic about their mission. Barbas, who appears in the game as a dog, is Clavicus Vile's shape-shifting familiar, but the equivalent figure in Peryite's service is the disease itself, which carries the prince's will more efficiently than any single agent could. Ancestor moths follow their caretakers through life, the sacred moths of the cult of the ancestor moth, which appear in the Dawnguard DLC during the ritual in the Ancestor Glade, are not simply animals used in a ceremony. In the lore of the cult, ancestor moths carry within them the encoded spiritual heritage of mortal bloodlines. The silk they produce, harvested through a ritual that involves the moths landing on the priest as they sing, contains what the cult calls fjerons, a term for the essential record of a soul's experiences after death. Weaving that silk and embroidering it with genealogical information creates garments of genuine spiritual power. The moths themselves are considered to embody the ancestors they are connected to, which is why the blinded priests at the Temple of the Ancestor Moths continue to care for them after their final reading has taken their sight. They can no longer read the scrolls. They can still tend the moths, and in tending them they maintain their connection to the divine framework that gave their scholarship meaning. The Ancestor Glade in Skyrim is a natural node in this network, a place where the boundary between the moths' function as physical creatures and their function as spiritual conduits is unusually thin. The way the moths gather around the moth priest in the ritual and then allow themselves to be used in the reading is described less as the behavior of trained insects and more as willing participation. The Greatwood of the Bosmer is still alive. Valenwood, the forested southern province of the Bosmer, contains trees of a scale that does not exist in any of the game worlds the Elder Scrolls series has allowed players to visit. The Grat Oaks, the walking trees that form the basis of Bosmer civilization, are so massive that entire cities are built within and on top of them. The Bosmer do not build cities and then name them after their location. The trees move, and the cities move with them, which means that a Bosmer town's physical location is not fixed. The trees walk. They follow routes that the Bosmer understand and can predict but cannot fully control. The Bosmer's religious practice, the Green Pact, forbids them from harming living plants in Valenwood and requires them to eat only meat, including the flesh of any sentient being they kill in battle. This dietary restriction exists because the Green Pact is a genuine covenant with Yifra, the storyteller, the forest deity who gave the Bosmer their form, and violation of its terms has consequences that the Bosmer treat as more serious than most Tamrielic law. The Green Pact also requires that Bosmer consume their fallen enemies, which makes Bosmer warriors among the more psychologically intimidating opponents in the continent. What Valenwood looks like, and what the Grat Oaks actually are at a cosmological level, remains one of the parts of Tamriel most unexplored in the games we have. Sanguine's Ring started one of Skyrim's best quests. The Daedric Prince Sanguine presides over debauchery, hedonism, and the darker pleasures of mortal existence, and his presence in Skyrim takes a form that is almost entirely comic, rather than threatening. The quest A Night to Remember begins when the Dragonborn accepts a drinking contest from a mysterious stranger in a tavern and promptly blacks out. The player wakes with no memory of the night before, scattered across Skyrim in increasingly absurd locations, having apparently done extraordinary things, while under the influence of Sanguine's magical mead. What makes this quest interesting from a lore perspective is what it reveals about Sanguine's character among the Daedric princes. He is genuinely jovial. He is not manipulating the Dragonborn toward a dark end, or seeking to corrupt them in any meaningful sense. He set up an elaborate magical prank, observed the chaos his mead created, and at the end offers his artifact with something resembling genuine warmth. The contrast between Sanguine and the more genuinely threatening Daedric princes encountered elsewhere in Skyrim is intentional. The lore treats Sanguine as a reminder that not all Daedric princes are malevolent in the same way. Some of them are simply interested in watching mortals have a terrible and memorable time. The College of Winterhole's Augur gave up his body for knowledge. Deep beneath the College of Winterhold, in a water-filled chamber called the Midden Dark, there is a being called the Augur of Dunlane who exists without a physical form. The Augur was a student who came too close to the Eye of Magnus, the artifact the college had been studying without fully understanding, and was transformed by the contact into something that is neither mortal nor Daedra, a consciousness that persists in the magical environment of the college's lower levels without a body to house it. He cannot leave. He does not appear to want to. The Augur of Dunlane has found, in his formless existence, a clarity of perception about magical matters that no ordinary student could achieve, because he is no longer limited by the biological constraints that make mortal thought approximate and incomplete. When the Dragonborn consults him during the college questline, he provides genuinely useful guidance and communicates with an equanimity about his condition that suggests he made his peace with it some time ago. What happened to him was not his choice, but what he has done with the existence that resulted from it represents a form of adaptation that the game treats as neither tragic nor triumphant. He is simply what the Eye of Magnus made him, and he has worked with that rather than against it. Falion in Mortal can cure vampirism. One of the most quietly significant characters in Skyrim is the mage Falion, who lives alone in Mortal and is regarded with deep suspicion by the town's population for his interest in matters the Nords find uncomfortable. Falion is the only person in the base game who can cure vampirism through a ritual at the stone circle outside town. His knowledge is not simply academic. He has studied soul trap magic, necromancy, and the planes of oblivion extensively, which is precisely what makes Mortal's residents distrust him. What his depth of knowledge actually represents in lore terms is a scholar who has pushed into areas that the College of Winterhold's curriculum treats as dangerous or forbidden, and has come out the other side with functional, practical understanding of how things work. He can cure vampirism because he understands both the soul magic that the vampiric curse involves and the ritual framework required to sever it. He has also reportedly seen Dwemer, according to one of his remarks, which, given that the Dwemer vanished in the First Era, either means he is making an extraordinary claim casually, or has had an experience that connects him to something in Tamriel's lore that has never been fully explained. Falion is the kind of character Skyrim excels at, quietly extraordinary in a way that rewards attention but never announces itself. Every dragon has a unique name that is also a title. Dragon names in the Elder Scrolls lore are not simply labels. In the dragon language, Dovazul, names function as compressed philosophical statements about the nature of their bearer. Because the dragon language actualizes meaning through sound, a dragon's name is also a declaration of what that dragon is. Alduin breaks into the words Al, meaning destroyer, Dew, meaning eat, and In, meaning master, destroyer, devour, master, or in one common rendering, world eater. That is not a title given to Alduin. It is a statement of his essence encoded into the sounds that identify him. Paarthurnax breaks into ambition, overlord, and cruelty, a name that reflects what he was before his conversion. Odaving, the Dragonborn captures in Dragon's Reach, translates to Snow Hunter Wing or Snow Hunt Wing. Durnavir, the undead dragon bound in the soul cairn, means curse never dying, an accurate description of his condition. This naming convention means that every time you encounter a dragon in the game world and read its name, you are receiving a specific piece of information about its nature and history. The nameless random dragons that attack hold capitals do not have this depth, but every named dragon in the story carries a philosophy embedded in their identifier that rewards attention to the language underlying the encounter. The Bard's College preserves knowledge the rest of Skyrim has forgotten. Solitude's Bard's College is treated primarily as a location where you can commission songs and pick up a light quest. but its actual function in Skyrim's cultural ecosystem is considerably more significant than that framing suggests. Bards in Tamriel are not simply entertainers. They are the primary mechanism through which oral history is transmitted in cultures that do not rely primarily on written records, and the Nordic tradition specifically invested enormous cultural memory in sung history. The legends of Ysgramor, the account of the Return, the histories of the great holds and their rulers, the records of battles and heroes that might otherwise be lost. All of these exist in the Bard's College's curriculum in forms that cannot be found in written libraries. The burning of King Olaf's effigy, the central ceremony of the annual burning of King Olaf Quest, connects to a specific historical controversy whether King Olaf One-Eyed genuinely captured the dragon Numinex or fabricated the account. What the college is actually debating is whether a piece of its preserved oral history is accurate, which requires a standard of evidence that oral tradition makes harder to apply. The college is not simply a school for musicians. It is an institution whose health determines whether the cultural memory of an entire civilization survives into the next generation. Its underfunded and slightly ridiculous presentation in the game is, in that light, a tragedy with comedic dressing. Mjol the Lioness has a history longer than her quest. The companion character, Mjol the Lioness, found in Riften and available as both a follower and a marriage option, has a backstory that the game implies rather than fully tells. She travelled across Tamriel as an adventurer for years, developed a deep contempt for the Thieves Guild's influence on Riften and the corruption it represented, and ended her adventuring career in the Dwemer ruin of Mazinchaleft, when she lost her sword Grimsever and nearly died there. What the game does not elaborate on is the texture of that career. Mjol has clearly been in serious trouble before and survived it. She speaks about the Thieves Guild and Riften's corruption with the specific anger of someone who has seen institutional corruption cause direct harm, not simply as a philosophical objection. Her devotion to cleaning up Riften is the project of someone who has decided that their remaining energy should go toward a problem they can actually address, rather than the abstract adventuring that led them into a Dwemer ruin without backup. She carries Erin, a Riften resident who helped her after Mazinchaleft, everywhere she goes in a relationship that the game codes as friendship and gratitude, but which reads in context as a form of protective attachment. She was saved once and has been protecting the person who saved her ever since. Windhelm is the oldest human city in Tamriel. Ulfric Stormcloak's capital is not simply a Nord stronghold with a dark street called the Grey Quarter. It is, by most accounts in the lore, the oldest continuously inhabited human city on the continent of Tamriel. Windhelm was founded by Ysgramor as his primary seat after the Return, making it the center of the first human civilization in Skyrim and one of the earliest permanent human settlements anywhere in Tamriel's history. The Palace of the Kings, where Ulfric sits, was built in the same period. The stones of Windhelm are genuinely ancient in a way that most of the structures the Dragonborn walks through in the game are not. The city's architecture reflects this: heavy stone that was built to last rather than to impress, functional in a way that speaks to a civilization still establishing itself rather than one at the height of its prosperity. The treatment of the Dunmer in the Grey Quarter, crowded into one section of the city and denied access to most of the social institutions Windhelm offers its Nord population, occurs in the oldest human city in Tamriel. The irony of Windhelm's role as the seat of Nordic identity claims occurring against a backdrop of systematic discrimination against refugees is one the lore is fully aware of and does not soften.